Okay, so let's get started. We're going to be taking a look in this training module at how to set up our trigger offset and our Link G5 and G4X programming. Our trigger offset is one of the most critical parameters that we have to program within our Link system. The trigger offset is going to represent the virtual connection between the link and the engine's position. So it allows the link to understand when the engine's rotating around within the auto cycle exactly where things are at. We base things like spark timing and fuel injection off of our engine's position. So you can imagine if your trigger offset isn't right and Link doesn't understand exactly where your engine's at within the auto cycle, spark timing and fueling calculations won't happen at the correct time. The engine either won't start and run properly or be really sluggish because the ignition timing is way retarded, or you may have too much spark timing advanced and damage the engine very quickly with knock. So we want to make sure the trigger offset is correct before we even actually do any tuning. We're going to be verifying the trigger offset under cranking, and then when the engine actually fires off, verify the trigger offset with the engine running, because things can change a little bit. But we want to make sure we're in the ballpark with our trigger offset to get the engine to actually fire off and run, because if we're way out, we might get popping and spinning and backfiring out of the engine, or again, just a no start condition at all. So very, very important that we get this set up correctly the first time. All right, let's go and take a look at where we can find our trigger offset in our software here. We're gonna move from our basics page and jump into the cam crank page. We spent some time in the last few tutorials within this specific page talking about the different trigger modes and setting up our trigger 1, trigger 2, which is gonna be our crank and our cam. And we've talked about the difference between the Hall effect sensors and the reluctor sensors and how to set and configure those up. So at this point, I'm going to assume that your trigger setup and trigger 1, trigger 2 are configured properly for your engine. The next step here is actually then checking the trigger offset. So if we go here into our calibrate window, we're going to find trigger offset, reference timing, and then set base timing. The set base timing has a little icon wrench right here. If we click on this, another sub window opens up, allowing us to actually access the trigger offset and the reference timing. Now, the lock ignition timing too. This feature allows us to override all the other spark timing command within the link. So we have a normal spark timing table. That's where we want to fire off our spark plug. Within the auto cycle, we have some corrections that happen. At any given time, the spark timing, which is measured here at the ignition angle parameter, this is representative of our spark timing. This is going to be always dynamic, meaning at idle, part throttle, wide open throttle. This value is constantly changing. If we're checking our trigger offset, we have to have a fixed locked timing value. We can't have it moving around. So we use our lock ignition timing too, and we put a value right here of wherever we want to lock it at. You can get verification that your ignition timing is actually locked by looking at your ignition angle window right here. It should match what you have it set to right here. So if you set it at 10, this should show 10 under cranking or having the engine run. If you set this at 0, this should show 0. The next parameter here, adjust offset until ignition timing matches the number above. This is going to be our trigger offset value that we find right here. So you can't directly edit these parameters. You have to go into the setup window using this wrench icon. So this will be our trigger offset value. Now we're going to go over the multi-tooth missing option here. That's going to be kind of a more universal pattern that we're dealing with. That has some specific things in terms of the value we place here for the trigger offset. We can actually figure this out before we even fire off the engine or crank it. And I'll talk about that towards the end of the tutorial. But what we'll find is that this trigger offset value is something that we're going to typically go about kind of trial and error to figure it out. And then we'll talk about what happens if the engine actually doesn't fire off. This value might need to be adjusted by 360 degrees, and we'll get into that a little bit later. We also have our adjust delay. This accounts for the latency in response of your ignition system. So we normally start off with this value at 0 microseconds. And then once the engine's fired up and running, we'll rev the engine up while we're locking the timing at something like 20 or 30 degrees. We verify with a timing light that the timing is actually staying locked. If it's starting to retard as the engine RPM is going up, so we see the spark timing starting to actually drop off a little bit, we'll adjust our microsecond value here. That will allow you to then directly account for the latency response in the ignition and correct any ignition retard, because if we lock the timing, it should stay locked. So this is something we explore after we've set the trigger offset and after the engine's actually fired up and running. So we understand what these parameters represent, what we're going to be doing with these. We'll talk about the actual process here in a second. The very first thing we want to do is check our trigger offset with the engine and cranking conditions. We don't want to fire off the engine yet. We want to simply double, triple check the trigger offset is going to be reasonable. Let's go ahead and cancel here real quick. What I want to do is turn off combustion, but I don't want to kill my spark, because if I turn the spark off, if I turn the actual coil outputs off in the link, we can't check with a timing light. We need spark to actually happen. So we can actually turn off the fuel injectors. That'll kill combustion because we want the engine to just simply crank over. You could go in, instead of programming the injectors to be turned off, you could go in and unplug your ejector clips. That's another very easy option, might be a valid option. You can also accomplish the same thing without actually unplugging the injector clips by going here to the injection mode and setting this to off. Pretty simple there. Click OK, and now the injectors won't spray fuel when you're cranking. So two different things are happening here. One, we have no combustion. It'll give us the ability to check the timing with a timing light properly in cranking conditions. Number two, the injectors won't be spraying fuel when we're going in and trying to check the trigger offset, which allows us to not foul out the spark plugs and potentially wash the cylinder down with fuel. So we definitely want to do this. Again, either unplugging the injectors or shutting your injection mode to off kills the injectors, so allows us to simply crank over the engine, and the engine will not fire off.
Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here, and you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.